Good evening, and welcome to the very first in a series of Georgetown African American Historic Landmark Projects lectures leading up to the installation of over 40 plus historic bronze markers featuring the accurate stories of African Americans who lived in, worked in, and assisted in building Georgetown. My name is Andrina Crockett, and I am the founder and president of the project. The brief background and updates on the project. The project was started in 2017 when Georgetown University announced the sale of 272 enslaved to keep the university operational. That's 272 enslaved. Of course, we asked where did they live and what was their role, and got an answer, but it didn't satisfy us. So we went searching for where the African Americans lived on Georgetown campus and in Georgetown. Luckily, there was a book, Black Georgetown Remembered, written by Janet Lesko, that provided the outline for our project. In 2017, the United Nations designated Georgetown Waterfront a UNESCO Site of Memory, and we will be building a memorial on that site. Installation of the 6-inch markers will begin next Saturday, the 21st of November. And this is a 6.5-inch marker, which designates buildings with significant African American history, both enslaved and enslaved, or buildings that were owned by African Americans in Georgetown. We start out with our logo, and I have to acknowledge the L'Enfant Trust easement project, which also has markers in Georgetown. They encouraged us to design a marker, a logo that was more indicative or more reflective of our heritage. We went to the Adinkra symbols, and I'm sure you recognize the outside circumference being Sankofa, which means go back to your past and learn from your past. The inside circumference, Nia Orinum Sua, which means he who does not know can know through learning. And in the center, the symbol means reconciliation. There will be three designs: roadside, wayside at a 45-degree angle, and then on the Market House at 3276 M Street, there will be a plaque affixed to the wall. This is Yarrow's markers layout. The black will be polished and raised. The text will be polished and raised, and the logo will be in the center. It will be polished on a brown background. I want to thank the Philadelphia Museum of Art for giving us permission to use this painting of Yarrow done by the presidential portrait painter Charles Peale in 1817. It will be made into a porcelain tile and embedded in the marker. The map just shows the sites of the public space markers. There will be 20 There is one missing because it's off the map. It's located at the grocer, the nursery in the 4900 block of Reservoir Road. Before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to remind everybody we will be having these virtual happy hours once a month. In February, we'll probably double up from 7 to 8, the third Tuesday of the month. Jim Johnson, our guest speaker, he gave me 2 lines to introduce him, but he is worth more than 2 lines. He said, Jim Johnson is a lawyer, writer, journalist, and lecturer in Washington, D.C. And he is the publisher of 4 books. But it is one of those books that we are focused on, and his research and the time spent on writing this book is unparalleled. From Slave Ship to Harvard, Yarrow Mammoth, and the history of an African American family. Freed at age 60 after 44 years of enslavement. Mr. Johnson is going to tell you what he accomplished. The Library Journal describes the book as a historical narrative, part genealogical detective work. His book will appeal to a range of academic and general readers, especially those interested in race relations in early America. The Metropolitan Museum of Art states this book is in turn disturbing and elevating, horrifying and inspiring. It is impossible to ignore. A masterfully researched detective story with a wealth of detail about the rise of an African American family. And lastly, a mammoth story is of Islam in early America, slavery in the nation's capital, and or the role free Blacks played to free their sisters and brothers. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Jim Johnston.
Thank you, Andrina. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you always, and to talk to all the people that are watching tonight, and to all the what you're doing in Georgetown. You know, historically, a third of Georgetown was African American, and I think it's very important to keep that in mind and to have physical evidence of that. With that, let me start my presentation, which is a PowerPoint, and we'll run through it. The book is From Slave Ship to Harvard. I'm sorry, this is starting at the very back. We'll have to go back through this, all the way back through the slides. You're going to run through these slides backwards. And when I did this book, I'm just going to first, people ask me why I did this and how I got interested. And this is the way. I was at the Georgetown Public Library researching a book, and I was in the Peabody room. And some of the pictures, such as this one, actually were taken the day these things happened. And I stood up from this desk right here, and I looked across the room to that portrait, and it said in the bottom right-hand corner, Yarrow Mammoth by James Alexander Simpson, 1822. And I thought that was pretty interesting, since Georgetown is generally a lily white area in most people's minds. So I went home and Googled the name, and I got this portrait, which was by Charles Wilson Peale. A friend of mine was the director of the National Museum of American Art, and I asked her about this man and these portraits. She said, I don't know anything about African American portraiture, but I can tell you that any portrait of an African American prior to the Civil War is rare, and you have two of the same man, so you might do something. And it took 8 years. And I decided when I finished to tell the story as a story of race in America. And with that, I start with tobacco. We think that slaves were brought to America for cotton, and that's not the case. Cotton gin wasn't invented until 1795. The slaves started coming in large numbers to Maryland in about 1700. And it was because of this tobacco plant, because it was the cash crop that would buy goods from England. And it started in Jamestown very early on and spread to Maryland when Maryland got founded. And so the whole goal was to raise tobacco and ship it to England. At first, they brought in indentured servants and convicts from the Great Britain. But then, as I said, by 1700, they began turning to slaves from Africa. Tobacco had to be, the whole point was to get it to Europe for sale. And so what they would do would put it at the end of the growing season, cure it and put it in these hogshead and roll it down to a body of water where they could float it down on a skiff to some port that would handle sailing ships. But if you roll it more than 10 miles, it ruins the tobacco. And therefore, as a result, when you look at a Google satellite of Maryland, you can see the water areas, the Chesapeake Bay, these rivers in Virginia, and the Potomac River. And so all of these tobacco plantations had to be within 10 miles of one of these bodies of water. And they kept going up the Potomac until they got here, where there's a 40-foot deep hole in the Potomac. And this was the last tobacco port on the Potomac. And we know that today as Georgetown. And that 40-foot hole was dug by Rock Creek, and there's the Kennedy Center. So tobacco explains both why there were slaves in America and also why the capital of the United States is located where it is, because it was close to George Washington's Mount Vernon and just east of the tobacco port, Georgetown. As I said, we're trying to get goods to England. We'd send tobacco to England and bring in goods from England. And in Bladensburg, this house still stands. It's Bostwick. And it was built by a man named Christopher Lowndes, and that's Lowndes. And he was an importer and exporter. He'd export the tobacco, he'd import pins, hammers, nails, everything you needed, and sell it. And again, this is in Bladensburg. But he also imported slaves. And in fact, the Lowndes family were big slave traders, transatlantic slave traders. This is from the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. If you've never been there, it's a great resource. But there were 4 Lowndes brothers, Christopher here and another brother here. He had a brother in Liverpool, which was the center of the English slave trade, and a brother in St. Kitts, which was kind of a switching point. The slave ships would come from Africa, and when they got to St. Kitts, they would be told where the best market was. If you go to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, you will see that one of the Lowndeses was involved in ships over a period of 40 years that brought over 10,000 slaves to the New World. They were the second largest slave traders in the colonies. And in fact, Christopher Lowndes' son, Francis, as you can see here, actually captained 3 slave ships to Africa. So they got their hands very dirty. Francis Lowndes built, this is Tudor Place in Georgetown. You may know it's fanciest house in Georgetown. Francis Lowndes was responsible for this part, and then when they sold it, the Peters built this part. But this very fancy Tudor Place was built by money from the transatlantic slave trade. This man is Benjamin Stoddard. He married Christopher Lowndes' daughter. He was the first Secretary of the Navy under John Adams. So this is how high up in the government of the United States the slave trade went at that period of time. The ship they used commonly was called a snow, S-N-O-W or S-N-A-U. It was a shallow 2-masted vessel. I call it the Federal Express of the slave trade because it could sail up the rivers of Africa and buy 5 or 10 or 20 slaves here. And then when it got a full ship, it would sail to America or to the Western Hemisphere and sail up the rivers there and sell them to the plantations. And as I showed you with that Google Earth shot of Maryland, there were rivers, all these plantations were on some kind of river, so the slave ships usually could deliver the slaves right to the plantation. This is how a slave ship captain described the ships and the conditions. The slave lodging rooms below the deck are sometimes more than 5 feet high and sometimes less. And this height is divided towards the middle, for the slaves lie in 2 rows, one above the other, on each side of the ship, close to each other, like books upon a shelf. I have known them so close that the shelf would not easily contain one more. Cramped for want of room, the slaves are likewise in irons, for the most part both hands and feet, and 2 together, which makes it difficult for them to turn or move, to attempt either to rise or to lie down without hurting themselves or each other. And the slaves would be kept below decks for the entire voyage, which would last anywhere from 1 to 3 months. Many would die. It was said that on the open ocean, a slave ship could be smelled for a mile away because of the terrible conditions on the ship. That was written by this slave ship captain named John Newton, who after 3 voyages got sick of it and became an Anglican minister. And in fact, he was the religious force behind the move in England to abolish the slave trade. And he also was a songwriter, and he wrote the hymn Amazing Grace, which is one of the reasons it's become a symbol and a song for human rights around the world. Yara Mahmood now. And when he was in the early part of the 1700s, he was a Fulani Muslim, and they were in Mali, and they began moving to the coast of West Africa. And when they did, of course, they ran into religious wars with the indigenous populations in these countries, mainly Senegal and Guinea, to some extent the Ivory Coast. And these wars broke out. And when they did, the Fulani, who had organization, European weapons, and alliances with Europeans, usually won. And when they won, they take their prisoners of war and sell them to the slave ships. But sometimes they lost. And when that happened, they got sold to the slave ships. And so that's how Yara Mahmood, a Fulani Muslim, got into the slave trade to America. Now, when John Newton and others tried to get Parliament to abolish the slave trade, they developed this drawing, which shows these terrible conditions on the slave ship. But as I was writing the book and doing my research, I knew one thing. I had a portrait of one of these slaves, and therefore, throughout my research, I focused, and this presentation, I try to focus on portraits. And therefore, there's this portrait of Ayuba Suleiman Diallo. He was another Fulani Muslim. He was brought to Maryland 20 years before Yarrow in 1732. He was educated, he could read and write, and his father was a imam in West Africa. So when he got here, he was taken out to the eastern shore and put on a tobacco plantation. The white boys kicked dirt in his face when he bowed to pray. Very unhappy, obviously. And so he did an unusual thing. He sat down and he wrote a letter, and he said, "Dear Dad, get me out of here." Now, how he thought that letter was going to get back to his father in Africa is an interesting question. But strangely enough, it did get to some men in England who said, "Oh boy, let's bring this fellow to England and learn about him." And so they did. And here is a portrait by an English painter named William Hoare, who was a student of Thomas Gainsborough. It's a magnificent portrait. It's in the National Portrait Gallery in London. And this portrait and the portrait of Yara Mahmood by Charles Wilson Peale are 2 of a handful of paintings of men who were on slave ships. So these are very rare portraits. Here is the ad for Yara Mahmood's arrival in Annapolis from the Maryland Gazette. Just imported in the Elijah, Captain James Lau, directly from the coast of Africa. A parcel of healthy slaves consisting of men, women, and children. and will be disposed of on board the said vessel in the Severn River on Thursday, the 4th day of June, 1752, for sterling money, bills of exchange, gold, or paper currency. Benjamin Tasker Jr. and Christopher Lowndes, the slave trader I was telling you. But Lowndes had married Tasker's sister, so these men were brothers-in-law, and Tasker's father was the acting governor of Maryland. So that, again, that's how high up in the slave trade this went. I mean, in the colonial governments this went. Here's Annapolis, the Severn River, the port of Annapolis. My guess is the Elijah was anchored right about here, and there's the Naval Academy. And I have another portrait, Elizabeth Tasker Lowndes. This is Christopher Lowndes' wife, done by Charles Wilson Peale. So, you know, Peale was painting both slave in Yarrow and the slave trader's wife. She doesn't look terribly good in this because she was dying. Now, Yarrow got to America. He was owned by first Samuel Bell until he died, then Brooke Bell, his son, until he died, and then by Upton Bell, who freed Yarrow. And you can see Upton Bell has a miniature. So I have, again, portraits not only of Yarrow, but also of the last man to own him. Samuel Bell was a tobacco planter. He had 63 plantations around Maryland. He also was the sheriff of Frederick County, which ran from Rock Creek to the mountains. And he was a sort of an engineer, and his specialty was water mills. And this is Pierce Mill in Rock Creek Park. I suppose many of you know it. He didn't, this isn't his building, but he was the first one to put a mill there. And then he moved up to Sharpsburg to the Antietam Iron Works and used his water-powered mills to help pound the iron or in forges. And his house was here, Kelly's Purchase, right off the Antietam battlefield. It was a field house built during the Battle of Antietam, just this red brick house. And Yarrow went with him. And when Samuel Bell died in 1777, his will contained a bequest of my Negro boy Yarrow, and that's Yarrow Mammoet. And the word boy doesn't mean the pejorative sense it does today, but rather a body servant. That was someone who accompanied his owner around all day. He was more than a valet. He would, in the case of Samuel Bell, he would be a second gun for a sheriff. He'd be someone to talk to while you're riding around as going to all these plantations. And he would meet the important people. So Yarrow Mammoet, therefore, was able to see Maryland and the colonies in a way a field slave couldn't do. He could see how all of this worked, how big it was, and he understood how to do business, and he learned how to do business, and he met men who would later become important in Georgetown, so that when he got free, he had people who had known him most of his life. So it was good for both of these people. Slavery is not good, but if you're going to be a slave, the body servant is the way you want to do it. When Samuel Bell died, Brooke Bell inherited him. There's a 2,000 acre estate out here. This is River Road, west of the town of Potomac, and Belmont was a 2,000 acre plantation out here, and it was marked by Bell Mountain Road, and on down the road is Bell Spring Road. But right across river from this sign is this. This is a water mill, and this was on the Bell property, and I'm sure Yarrow helped build this water mill. But more importantly is that on this property up here, this was another tobacco farm, and on that property, a woman gave birth to Yarrow's son. So I know that Yarrow was here 9 months before his son was born to a woman on this property. And his son's name was Aquila. Yarrow got him freed at age 7. In 1784, Brooke Bell moved to Georgetown. He kept his Belmont property, but he became an importer and exporter in Georgetown. And his accounting book is still in existence. And here's an entry for Yarrow. The MDHS is the Maryland Historical Society. That's an acetate they required me to put over it when I took the photograph, but it's up in Baltimore, is his accounting book, and it also shows various things that Yarrow did. In 1796, Brooke Bell died, and this is the inventory of his estate, showing Yarrow was 60 years old, meaning he was born in 1736. And he said, here's how he said he got free. And this is in dialect, but listen to the words, the poetry. Old Massa Ben Tinky got all the work out of a yarrow bone. He tell a yarrow, go free, yarrow. You've been work enough for me. Go work for you now. Tanky Massa, yarrow say. Sure enough, yarrow go to work for he now. Yarrow work a soon a late, a hot, a cold. Sometime he sweat, sometime he blow a finger. But there's poetry in here. He knows his name rhymes with marrow bone. And so he says, get all the work out of a yarrow bone. He's making a joke. Bear in mind, this man's first language was Fulani. And as you're going to find out, he also could speak Arabic. He may have been able to speak French if he was Senegal, but he's working in a third or fourth language. Down here at the bottom, he says, sometime he sweats, sometime he blow a finger. He means that sometimes he sweat in the hot, and in the winter, when his fingers are cold, he blow a finger. I love this phrase of blow a finger. And, you know, you can see why Samuel Bell would have liked to have this man riding with him as he went from plantation to plantation. He's a charming individual. Yarrow then bought, when he got free, he bought a property in Georgetown. This is the lot. And this is, he then turned around and redeeded it to his son. And I went to the National Archives and took this photograph on the day I saw this. In fact, almost the instant I saw it. And you can see it's all in nice, neat handwriting until you get here. And I, of course, had suspicions about that. An Arabic expert told me that it looks like he signed his name in English, or tried to, with what looks like Josie. But this word, people say, is quite clear, is Bismillah, and it means in the name of God. So he invoked Allah, a blessing from Allah, in signing an important document like a deed. And then Charles Wilson Peale came to Washington to get a portrait of the new president, James Monroe, and to paint other portraits. Peale had done 7 life portraits of George Washington. He then, and he had crossed the Delaware, fought during the Revolution. He didn't paint that famous painting, but he did in fact cross the Delaware as an officer with the militia. And after the war, he opened this museum in Philadelphia, and he was where he had various objects. It was like the Smithsonian. He was sort of the inventor of that concept in America, and it was a for-profit museum. But he came to Washington and he found Yarrow, and he heard, he heard about Yarrow and heard that he was opening, heard that he was had a house and lot and owned bank stock. And so Peale wanted to make a portrait of him. And I do want to talk about, there's no good record for why Peale made this portrait this way, but if you notice, he's got a big great leather coat on. And you see the great coat here, that's Peale's. Yarrow couldn't afford that. He's got a blue jacket on, a red waistcoat, a white shirt. But Peale actually believed that black people and white people were equal, and that if you gave them equal opportunity, they could get just as far. And so I view this as Peale saying, look here, this is a wealthy Georgetowner. He just happens to be black. And that is sort of a political message I see in this, but there's no record as to why he painted it this way. Clearly, it's an elegant painting. Peale talked to the woman who had owned Yarrow, Brooke Bell's widow. She lived in this house, which is right across from Tudor Place today. So I can see Peale walking up there and talking to her and getting information about her. And then Yarrow died in 1823, and Peale wrote this obituary in the Gettysburg Compiler. And it's February 1823. Died at Georgetown on the 19th Ultimo. That's the prior month, so January 19th. Negro Yarrow, aged, Peale thought he was 136 years old. He wasn't, he was 86. Yarrow was interred in the corner of his garden, the spot where he usually resorted to pray. My favorite here is the last. Yarrow was never known to eat a swine nor drink ardent spirits. He was a good Muslim, and so he didn't drink alcohol or eat pork. Then as the book moves through, to his sister, who was Hannah, Free Hannah, or Hannah Peale. I think she worked here in Rockville at Hungerford's Tavern, which was right next to the courthouse. And Yarrow's owner was the clerk of that courthouse. So Yarrow would have visited her. I went to the will of the man who owned this, and I found these slaves with African names. And there was a naming convention among the Fulani that allowed me to at least guess at who might be a Fulani. And you can see Hannah, who I think was Yarrow's sister. This woman, the Calabi, is identified as Hannah's daughter. There was Isaac with the Fulani name of Ashaka. There was Yarmuth with the Fulani name Yanus. And there was another Yarrow living there, and that's Fulani. And the name Yarrow is unique to the Fulani. These taverns were, and then as I get into a story of race, these taverns were strange places. They were the biggest building in town. And now David Warden, writer at the time, said, the slaves sleep on the floor of the dining room, which the master for obvious reasons ought to forbid. They, meaning black people, have an uncommon desire for spirituous liquors. So you see the racism in what a white person is writing about black people in 1816. But Josiah Henson lived in Rockville. And he was the model supposedly for Uncle Tom's Cabin. And he wrote an autobiography. And here's how he described white people in Rockville at the time. And this is the same time as David Warden was writing. My master's habits were such as were common enough among the dissipated planters in the neighborhood. And one of their frequent practices was to assemble on Saturday or Sunday and gamble, run horses, or fight gamecocks, discuss politics, and drink whiskey and brandy and water all day long. They were not able to find their way home at night, and each one ordered his body servant to come after him. And when quarrels broke out, when pistols were fired and dirks were drawn, it was the duty of the slaves to rush in and drag his master from the fight and carry him home. So you can see this is the way black people saw white people and their proclivity for alcohol. This sounds much truer than what Warden wrote. I then moved to Hannah's daughter, this Nancy Hillman, who was Yarrow's niece. She lived in Frederick. She was married to Ignatius Hillman, who was the servant of Judge Richard Potts. And Frederick at the time was a very important town for lawyers. Francis Scott Key got his start there, as did Roger Brooke Tawney, who became Chief Justice of the United States. And Tawney would have known Yarrow's niece, Nancy Hillman. The Hillmans were a very prominent black family in Frederick. And yet it was Richard Tawney who wrote Dred Scott and said, in the Dred Scott opinion, African Americans had for more than a century before the Constitution been regarded as beings of an inferior order and unfit to associate with their white race, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. And therefore Tawney ruled that Dred Scott had no constitutional rights. This, of course, was outrageous and brought calls in the North to abolish the Supreme Court, which might have been a good idea, but who knows. In any event, when I was doing the research, I then found that Nancy Hillman was buried in the Catholic cemetery of St. John's Catholic Church. This is the black section of the cemetery. There's a Nanny Hillman, one of the Hillman family, not Nancy. And these unmarked graves, the tombstone said, were the black graves of people buried before the Civil War, because African Americans weren't using tombstones. But if you go right across there, you come to the grave of Roger Brooke Tawney. This racist is buried in an integrated cemetery. And therefore you may be a bigot during your life, but you may spend eternity with the opposite race. So think about bigotry. I'm going to skip over Yarrow's son, generally Aquila, and move to Aquila's wife, who was Mary Polly Turner Yarrow. She was Samuel Bell and her owner Sam Turner were in business together. They also had farms next to each other out by Potomac. In 1832, she's recorded as being with Aquila Yarrow in a schedule of free persons of color in Washington County. And right after this was done, Aquila died and she became a widow. This is the inventory of Aquila's estate. You can see in the corner here, Polly, meaning these things belong to her. And you can also see, my favorite is at the bottom, a lot of books Aquila could read. This is a small town. This is not even a town. It's just a farm in Washington County, Maryland, near Harper's Ferry. And he had a lot of books, which surely meant he was reading. when I did this, I wanted to go up there and find out, more because I knew Yarrow had worked at Antietam and Sharpsburg. So I took a drive up there, and when I was looking at a map, I suddenly discovered this, Yarrowsburg Road. I didn't know it was there. In fact, I never heard of it. And I drove down here, and this is Yarrowsburg. There's no town, just an intersection. And I talked to a man, and two men were over here, and I asked them why it was called Yarrowsburg, and Bill Mullenix said to me, "Oh, that's easy. My grandfather told me it was named for a woman named Polly Yarrow. She was the midwife here. She delivered all the babies black and white." And I saw that parentheses on that inventory with Polly in my head, and I knew that this was Polly Yarrow's place, and the place was named Yarrowsburg after her. This is Elk Ridge. And if you go over there, you come here to the Kennedy Farm, which is where John Brown and his men stayed before they raided Harper's Ferry. So it's sort of all this Black history is located up there. And then from Polly Yarrow, I moved to her nephew, Simon Turner, who was born on the Crampton Farm in this house in 1839. This is the slave quarters. The owner said it had been the slave quarters ever since his family owned it in 1865. It had been called the slave quarters. They undoubtedly got Polly Yarrow, the midwife, to deliver Simon. And then his widow wrote this about the history of that family. "Simon Turner and I were both slaves when we were married. My husband belonged to Eli Crampton and I belonged to John Gray. They were coming around drafting men in 1864, and Simon said he wanted not to be drafted, and so he enlisted. And when he did, he enlisted in the 39th Regiment U.S. Colored Troop. Here is the only photograph of them with the white officers in the front. But there are Turners alive today in Baltimore, and when I showed this photograph to them, they said, he looks like Uncle Mark. And indeed he does. So that might be Simon Turner, but I don't make a claim to it. In 1875, there was this map of Pleasant Valley with Elk Ridge, Harper's Ferry down here, and Mrs. Yarrow's house is here. This is Arthur Sands's house. This is where Simon Turner lived with his father-in-law's family. And then Polly died. So not only did Yarrow Mammoet get his obituary in a white newspaper, but so did Polly Yarrow in 1885. The next in the family is Emma Turner, Simon's daughter, a bright girl. And so when she got out of 8th grade, that was as far as the Black schools went in Pleasant Valley, she was sent over to Harper's Ferry, that's John Brown's firehouse, to go to school at Storer College. She went to preparatory school there and then got a college degree, the first in the family to get a college degree. And here she is in 1956. The important thing, again, these are in-laws. They're not blood relatives of Yarrow Mammoet, but she knew Polly Yarrow because Polly died when this Emma was 10 years old. So she knew Polly Yarrow, and there are women alive today who knew her. They were her granddaughters. And finally, her son, Robert Turner Ford, entered Harvard in 1923. There were only 7 in his class, and this is his graduation picture in 1927. And in 1984, he went back at a reunion and gave this talk saying, in the Black society in which I was born and bred, there was almost idolatrous faith in education. College graduates were rare. 2 of his uncles were illiterate and 2 were slaves. And the possession of a diploma of any kind identified one as being a member of an elite group. A graduate of Harvard with all of its traditions was viewed as the epitome of academic and social merit. I got a lot of my research in Yarrowsburg at Mount Moriah Church. This is Simon Turner, the Civil War veteran's tombstone. It says he fought to save the Union. And I've led you through all of these people in this very short talk. And here's the Turner family when I met them in my research. This is Robert Turner Ford's daughter, Alice, and these are her cousins, Denise Dungy, Cynthia Richardson, Emily Willis, and Gloria Dennis. And she passed away right before the book was published. And then in 2015, they did an archaeological dig in Yarrow's backyard of his house. And the red soil here is the soil from his time, and they had to dig through all this overfill to do it. And one of the objects that always entranced me was this. It was a box buried at the level of Yarrow's soil and purposely buried. As you can see that it was put there and then fill dirt put around it. Now, I've taken you through all of this in about half an hour. It took them 175 years. And my contact information is here. The easiest way, if you want to ask me questions, just go to my website, jameshjohnston.com. You can see there at the bottom. And my email address is there. And also I have a blog from slaveshipblogspot.com. Andrina, I'm going to stop my screen share and turn it back to you.
Am I up?
You are.
Okay. Jim, thank you so much. I know it was a rush job, but I think we got the gist. To my audience, now you see why we're starting with Yarrow Mammoth. Through Jim's research, we know so much about him. I also want to redirect you back to the lot. The Macaulay family, we thank you so much for allowing us to put the marker at 3324 Dent Street. Our audience, you will hear more about this location as we progress in the installation of the markers. I also want to go back and thank the Georgetown Neighborhood Library. Those who have not been there, it is a treasure trove of history, focused almost 100% on Georgetown. I also want to thank the National Park Service. In 2019, Georgetown waterfront was designated as a UNESCO Site of Memory. And through the determination of Superintendent Washburn, we will be placing a memorial on national or federal property in the near future. So stay tuned for that. The webinars, the virtual happy hours will be every third Tuesday from 7 to 8. In December, we have the Clark family who were enslaved at the City Tavern on M Street. In January, we have the Queens family who in 1791 sued in the United States Supreme Court and won her freedom. Remember the name, Mary Papa Queen. In February, we have the Wormley family who own the Wormley Hotel right across the street from the White House. There will be a list coming out, but I want to get some questions from our audience before we go and in our last few minutes. So I'm going to turn it over to Jim again to answer some questions.
I see that there's a question about the Diallo painting. Is that a Quran hanging around his neck? It is indeed. It's a miniature Quran. When he got to England, when people arranged for him to be taken to England, and William Hoard did that painting, they bought him those clothes, traditional clothes, and they asked him to dress up as he would in his native land, and so he did that, including the Quran around his neck. Where people are asking, and this is to Andrina, will this recording be available to view again? If so, where?
Am I on? Yes, it will be. It will be. It is being recorded. ASALH, the Association for the Study of African American History and Life, will have it posted hopefully soon. And hopefully they will also be recording December's happy hour. It will be uploaded to our website. If anybody is interested in it before, you can email me and I can send you a copy. Brian, you know you can get whatever you need. So I will be sending you a copy.
I have another question. Was he ever able to go home? I don't know whether you mean by he Diallo or Yarrow. Yarrow was not able to go back to Africa. Unfortunately for Suleiman Ayuba Diallo, he was sent back to Africa to spy on the French because Guinea was English colony and Senegal was French colony. And so he went back to Africa voluntarily and was supposedly to spy on the French. They learned that he was spying on them, or at least suspected he was, and arrested him and put him in prison, and he died in prison. I get another question asking, was Yarrow his first or last name? Yarrow was his last name. It's very confusing. Let me blame it on Charles Willson Peale. Charles Willson Peale was pretty old when he did this painting and met with Yarrow, spent 2 days with him, and he was hard of hearing. So I think what happened was Yarrow said, my name is Yarrow. And so Peale wrote that down, and then Yarrow must have said, my name is Mamadou, not Mahmoud, but Peale heard it as Mahmoud, and he wrote that down in his diary. And then took the painting back, never labeled the painting. In 1947, Peale's biographer was trying to match up this diary he had with the paintings that were in storage, and he came up with this black person, and he said the only one that can be is Yarrow Mahmoud. And so that's how the painting got named. But in fact, there was this naming convention among the Fulani. There are only 4 or 5 last names among the Fulani, so they're worthless. They don't use them. When a child is born, they go to a imam or a holy man and get recommendations for a name. And if for a woman's 4th child, if it's male, one of the names that's available is Yarrow. That's a Fulani name. And then so that we know that he was his mother's 4th child. And then for the first name, one of the names that was available for a boy born on a Monday was Mamadou. And so his real name is Mamadou Yarrow. But Peale got it turned around, and it's too hard to fight history. And so his name has gone down as Yarrow Mahmoud. Any more questions? If not, Andrina, you can.
Have you finished all of them?
Oh, no, I've got a couple of more here. Can you tell us more about Yarrow's life in around Georgetown after he was free? Yes, I certainly can. That's an excellent question, and I didn't spend enough time on it. He was freed in 1796. He bought he then got a house in 1800, 4 years later. I think he only got the lot, and I think he built the house, and it was a log house. When I went through the tax records, I saw that the lot went from, in tax value, from I think $30 in the early 1800s up to $500 by 1815. So it was a heck of a good investment for him. I think he built the log house on the property. He also bought his son's freedom. He then there's a history told that some of it I'm not sure is true, but he lost his money twice, and because of people that held it for him died, or he loaned it to them and they died, or they got bankrupt. And finally, he earned in his old age $200. But he did, and I don't know how true those stories are. The clearly true story is that he did have a bank account, that he did own stock in the Columbia Bank of Georgetown, probably through his owner's name. And as Yarrow said, it was like a chicken. Every spring and every fall, it laid an egg, meaning it paid him dividends, and he lived off that. He was a brickmaker. He was the best brickmaker in Georgetown. He could earn 1.5 times as much as the white brickmakers did. He wove baskets and things and sold them. He was very devout Muslim and professed his faith. He led the Christmas caroling in Georgetown and went around the next morning to collect donations from the rich white people they had caroled to. And finally, he pulled his money out of the Columbia Bank of Georgetown right before it collapsed, right before it went bankrupt. and loaned money to white merchants. And his niece, Nancy Hillman, foreclosed a mortgage that he had on a loan he had given. She collected on that, I think, 27 years after he died. So the family kept and knew what they were doing. Do we have more questions? I got to get my. I read this one. Is he a good swimmer? Is that true? It is said he was the best swimmer on the Potomac. Were Yarrow's remains ever recovered? No. In 2015, we thought he was buried on the property when we did that archaeological dig. We didn't find any evidence of either a grave or even supposedly he was buried in the garden or a garden. I think, in fact, and I'm working on it now, that he was buried on an adjacent lot in a now lost black cemetery, and that was what Peel called his garden. I think we're probably out of time now, so I'm going to end the questioning and turn it back to Andrina.
So much, and we have a little bit of time. The time is limited. I want to remind everybody, this is about the Marker Project. This weekend and next week, we need 6.5-inch markers on properties either owned by African Americans or associated with them. Tudor Place will be one. I'm waiting for confirmation from Georgetown University, some of the homes where they live. So it starts this week. The other thing, I just wanted to remind you, the Clark family is next month. I'm going to turn it over to Jock now.
Well, good evening. My name is Jock Chandler, and I'm a board member of the Georgetown African American Historic Landmark Project and Tour. Excuse me. And I'm going to add my thanks to James Johnson for his enlightening and inspiring presentation, because Yarrow is a very special person, because of his faith, his work ethic, his integrity, and he is an inspiration for all of us. And it's proper that Yarrow is the first subject to be highlighted from the historic markers that will be installed in throughout Georgetown. And at this point, this is where the visitors will become part of the program. And what we're doing is you'll be able to help maintain our American history, because these markers don't install themselves. It takes money. It takes money to manufacture them, it takes money to install them, and it also takes money to maintain them. We need to do it for a 50-year period. So if you're encouraged and inspired by the accomplishments of an everyday person under extraordinary circumstances, just as Yarrow was able to read and write, he was bought property and was investing in stocks, we want you to invest in maintaining our history. So any amount that you can present or offer for us is greatly appreciated. Donate what's ever available in your budget, and you can donate the price of a book. The work of uncovering the history of Georgetown's African Americans has only just begun, and you are a crucial part of that work. As the IRS has not yet issued our organization a 501c3, you can donate through the website. It's www.gaahlp.org. And you can donate through PayPal or the contact information at info@gaahlp.org or at 272gcg@gmail.com. And as always, your comments and suggestions are welcome. This concludes our program. And as Edward R. Murrow closed, good night and good luck.